All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our second workshop in the IUSSI North American Section DEIJ workshop series. And before we start, I just really wanted to thank my co-committee members, Kaitlin Baudier, who is here and also one of our presenters, and Erica Ibarra Garibay, who is a grad student member, and she will be joining us a little bit late, but she's also part of that committee, as well as our past member, Bilu Das, who's here and is also part of our workshop subcommittee on the advisory board, which also includes Amy Dunlap, Terry McGlynn, Floria Morakep-Roy, and Ben Pyenson. And so thanks to all of those folks for helping make this possible. Okay, so the idea for this workshop actually came from our members, member feedback that we got from a survey that the DEIJ committee put together. Clearly, it's a moment where communicating science is more important than ever. It's rarely part of our paid work as social insect scientists, but finding ways to reach non-experts of all ages and share information and motivate people to care about science and the natural world is really critical. So I think this is so important, and I'm really excited that we were able to put this together. So the purpose of today is to hear from two experts in science, social insect science communication, who have been very successful in that realm. And they come to us with different backgrounds, experiences, and expertise, and they've been gracious enough to share that with us today. So welcome to Dr. Barrett Klein and Dr. Kaitlin Baudier for being here. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over to them. The workshop will be recorded, and then we will subsequently post the video to the IUSSI DEIJ website so that it can be viewed by anyone, anytime. As I mentioned before, we'll stop recording around 15 minutes remaining, so you can ask any questions off record that you wish to. If you feel comfortable doing so, please do keep your camera on so that we can make this as interactive and engaging as possible. That said, if you want to turn off your camera to eat something or whatever, you're welcome, and bringing your lunch is welcome. We will take a break about halfway through, a 5-minute bio break, really quick. So if you want to go grab your lunch or, use the restroom, stretch your legs, you can do so at that time. And you're also welcome to come and go. I know people are busy, and if you can only stay for part of it, that is fine. And the recording will be available later. We also intend to have another workshop in the spring of next year, but we have not yet decided on the topic. So what I'd like to do is I'm posting a link in the chat, and this is actually a short survey that if you follow that link, there is another link there to a survey where you can fill in preferences about frequency, length of workshops, if you have any ideas for workshop topics, or if you know anyone, or if you yourself would be interested in being one of our featured workshop speakers. So that
Amy,
is the housekeeping.
sorry.
Yeah.
The link you sent is a different that's the resources page. So I'm gonna just for everyone, I'll post the correct link in there.
Oh,
The
okay. I'm sorry.
no
Thank
worries, no
you.
worries.
Okay.
Mhm.
I think,
Yeah.
Amy, I think that link was how to find that powerful sexual stimulant that's full of ants.
Oh
You
no.
know.
Oops. All right. So I wanted to introduce our first expert here. So first up is Dr. Barrett Klein. Many of you already know Barrett, but in case you don't, Barrett is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. He's PI of the pupating lab, which investigates insect behavior, sleep biology, and also the way insects interact with humans throughout history. Barrett received his PhD from UT Austin in ecology and evolutionary biology, a master's in entomology from the University of Arizona, and bachelor's in entomology from Cornell University. He has created natural history exhibits for museums, including the American Museum of Natural History, has a really cool TEDx talk that you can find on his website, and created many stunning works of insect art. Visit pupating.org if you want to see some images of some of that work. and recently authored the book, The Insect Epiphany. So we are really thrilled to have Barrett here today to share his perspectives on communicating social insect science. Welcome, Barrett.
Thank you. I'm so glad that Amy invited me, and I'm thrilled to be here with fellow social insect lovers. I'd like to make this relatively informal, and I'd love for it to be as participatory as Zoom will allow. And what Kaitlin and I are aiming for is not only presenting different ways of, in my case, largely visualizing science and communicating science in a variety of ways, but also taking on your challenges, collectively thinking about visualization and other problems or challenges that you may be facing in any of your works, whether they deal specifically with social insect biology or not. So I'm going to dive in. I'll start with sharing largely things I've done so you get some background in my experiences, and I'll go relatively quickly through it. And if you want to spend more time with any one of those pursuits, I'd be happy to explain more. There. Is that coming through? How do I make this thing really small? Oh, that's making it. I want to get rid of this thing. Oops.
It looks good on our end.
Oh, is it really teeny?
No, it looks perfect.
Oh, it looks big. Like in the way big. One moment, let me just see if I can very quickly. There. Is that better? Are you guys there?
Barrett, I feel like you're hovering over the corners. We see only a picture, a heat map basically.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
So I think
interesting.
it's sharing only that screen. So you might want to share maybe your desktop if the, or
Oh, no, this is good. I just want the screen.
Yeah, it looks good to us.
Okay, great. Let me just start this one more time. And of course you can edit this. Let's try that again. Good. Oh. Let me start by talking a little bit about visualizing science using different techniques. And one, you saw an image of a thermal camera. Here, a wasp, Vescula germanica, is being mobbed by honeybees in the upper left there. They're both baking that wasp alive, and Apis mellifera is creating an envelope of CO2 to suffocate that wasp. Now, we can't see this as brilliantly without thermal imaging, so this is one technique of visualizing the relatively invisible. And below right, you can also use specialized microscopy images. This is looking in the brain of a bee, a sleeping bee. And we can talk about responsibly modifying photographs, in this case of a sleeping bee, and the power of visualizing through illustration. I'd argue the least abstract of the various visualization devices that we can harness as scientists. So with that image, for example, I found that it can be useful coupling a relatively abstract array of dots on an XY plot with something that's more intuitive. In this case, what's happening if you follow one dancer, like of this relatively precise dance, you might end up exiting the nest to collect food, versus this directionally sloppier, sleep-deprived dancer, you might end up switching dances to follow another dancer. And that's what this portrays, but I think it takes a little bit more mental effort to figure that out. So I'm going to present four different categories that I love to pursue in order to convey science ideas. The first is illustration, and here on the left, you've got probably the most famous doodle in all of biology by Charles Darwin in his notebook that has since been stolen and features the first visual metaphor of evolution, where he wrote, I think, and then you see the most recent common ancestor of A, B, C, D, all the way down here. So important was this visual metaphor, it ended up being the only visual centerfold on the origin of species. So I'll share some illustration projects that I've been involved with, like this famous Martialis Eureka ant from Mars, as E.O. Wilson dubbed it. So my friend Christian Robling, who found this 3 millimeter long ant in Manaus, Brazil, upon doing a genetic assay, found, hey, this is a really unusual new subfamily of ant that informs us about the ancestry, the history, the relatedness, the origins of ants. So he said, Barrett, could you draw it? And we overlapped for 24 hours. I took some notes and scribbled some sketches down while he described to me the particular character phenotypes that he wanted to depict in an image there. And so he found this above ground in the leaf litter, but being pale and blind and other features suggested that it was probably fossorial, burrowing. And so together we worked on an illustration that might give us a clue with some artistic license as to how this ant behaves. Second one, Tom Seeley needed help with depicting a particular behavior called gobbeting in honeybees. And this is where they take a droplet of water and they use it for various purposes, but they hold it unusually among their mouth parts. So what I did was I looked at different honeybees under microscopes, took photographs and other sketches that had been done in the past to produce something that Tom felt would be a better, more accurate, clear way of depicting this unusual behavior. Way back, unwisely, when I was a PhD student working on a very different project, John Abbott asked me to illustrate his Damselflies of Texas field guide. And I'm really glad he did, because it was a very different set of challenges. And what it involved was taking dead specimens, instead of just putting a specimen under the microscope and drawing it as I might, I would take that damselfly apart, clean and scan those different anatomical features, clean it up digitally, reassemble, and then paint with many layers digitally. So it was like gouache painting, and some of these damselflies would have upwards of 50 layers. And the value of that, the power in that, is that you could change small things in big ways very quickly. So if John Abbott came up to me and he said, well, actually, that damselfly is pretty close, but on average, there tends to be more pruinosity or tends to be yellower, then I could pick one layer or two layers and change those. And with Dave Rubik, I worked on stingless bee images. So these are the bee's knees in the lower right that distinguish males species. And they're mimics, like this acyllid robber fly, mimicking one orchid bee species and attacking a real orchid bee of a different species. Dung dramas, where we look at Onthophagus dung beetles and how the males can be short-horned, long-horned, and there are different scenarios in this soap opera below an elephant dung heap as to how the different short-horned males can still successfully mate with females. And with my mom, I wanted to show adaptive radiation across lineages of insects, color coding different mouthpart features. So scientific illustrations can be a really powerful way of picking out salient features really effectively. And we can talk about that at length more. Second category I wanted to introduce is natural history display making or exhibitry. On the left, we've got glass models by the father and son team, the Blashkas, that produce the thousands of glass flowers and plant models that are at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, as well as a cephalopod above. And then you've got the famous waxes like La Specola in Italy, Florence, Italy, with these beautiful, somewhat translucent waxes that look highly realistic. You can vivisect a wax woman, as many did training for medical reasons. So there's not only power in visualizing, there's utility in visualizing, in this case, three-dimensionally. And I worked on natural history display making at a studio in a museum, but I wanted to highlight today, social insects are hot at museums. So the Bruce Museum presently has an ants exhibit that a colleague of mine from the American Museum, Sean Murtha, has worked heavily on for the last months and months. And then on the lower right, you probably recognize this leafcutter ant fungal cultivar display by Ryan Garrett at the American Museum of Natural History's relatively new insect hall. So I worked at Chase Studio, which after 50 years closed when Terry Chase died last year, and at the American Museum, making exhibits that would be temporary, relatively permanent, sometimes traveling. And these were really great experiences because millions of people would see your work. And sometimes the ideal would be to have them see your work and not know that it was fake. We worked on an exhibit called Epidemic. I made giant viruses, and with a group of colleagues, we made helminths, fungi, protozoans of all sorts, single-celled eukaryotes, and also organismal biology, sometimes really giant, like that termite and that marbled orb weaver spider, sometimes actual size. And this was actually a really brilliant segue for me entering science again. I took a 6.5 year gap between my undergrad in entomology and grad school, and that was a time for me to explore the intersection of science and art. And I was really excited as a PhD student, for example, taking tools I'd learned in museum exhibitry and applying them, in this case, to tundra frog behavior. So the top is a photo by Ryan Taylor. Bottom is a robo frog that I made with animatronics by my friend Joey Stein. And so you'd have this wacky vocal sac extending male that would attract females. And it was enough, believe it or not, to fool them every time. And again, I just used standard procedures that I either made up or adopted and modified that involved taking maybe parts of bodies or directly sculpting and then molding and casting those individual parts with different materials that would allow flexibility, opacity, depending on what your needs are. Part 3, and this is the one that I hope we talk more about with your own personal challenges, and that can be writing papers, peer-reviewed publications, writing for popular articles, popular science, and books. And I've had the great good fortune this past year in publishing The Insect Epiphany through Timber Press. And that, I'll have to say, was a brilliantly positive experience from beginning to end. I loved it, and I'd be happy to explain why that particular experience was so positive. Part of it is, a big part, was it allowed me an excuse to really dive down rabbit holes and learn minutiae that I could categorize into stories that I wanted to tell about working with insects, whether it be their products, their body parts, their whole bodies, live or dead, making insects, as in this robo bee, or becoming insects. When does it pay to imitate different insects throughout human culture and across the world? And I'm presently working with Niels Rattenborg and John Leskew on a book about sleep across the animal kingdom. These are illustrations by my mother. On the left is a sleep tree, where you look at the branches dominated by what we have studied, mammals and birds with respect to sleep, and sometimes other vertebrates, and the paucity of studies dedicated to invertebrate, especially insect sleep. So I'll have big chunks of it dedicated to social insects as well as other insects. And that's been a really great experience as well so far. And finally, the last category is producing art at the intersection of biology and maybe more expressive fine arts. And sometimes that involves wearable art. So just this past Halloween, I had donned this 300 plus Bombyx mori silkworm moth cocoon laden mulberry branch helmet. And the idea there was I'm working on a few different projects, one for a new museum exhibit opening in Pennsylvania that involves sericulture. So I decided to really learn what it means to work with Bombyx mori silkworm moth from egg stage all the way through egg laying. And on the side, I worked on various art projects. So that allowed me to attain a better intimacy with those insects, a better understanding of their cultural applications, as well as to have a vehicle for outreach education. Because when somebody sees like a hive helmet like this one that was from a recycled bicycle helmet that I stuck in one of my beehives, and they built this exquisite wax architecture over it, and then I did paper mache below, or this paper wasp nest paper mache from their paper wasp nest paper, or this one made of at least 6 different species of insects products. When people are confronted with this vigilante in a dark alley, they tend to ask questions, and I tend to respond with stories about insects. And on the upper left, these are some of my honeybees building on my advanced copy, the first copy I held in my hands of the Insect Epiphany. I wanted to collaborate with my insects and have them build on it. And then with these others, you'll see termites are eating my book on a page open to termites as food, silkworm moth spinning silk on the book, open to a silk page, and then fire brats, zygentoma, running over their partially consumed page about silverfish. Different ways of visualizing and communicating science. So these are only a few: illustrating, exhibiting through natural history displays, publishing either pop science articles, which I've had the pleasure of working on this past year or two, and books. And finally, I've really argued that especially up-and-coming scientists, but any scientists, shouldn't dismiss the power, the potential of augmenting their science with hobbies, with avocations that they might otherwise dismiss or reject or put on hold unnecessarily. And for me, that's been pulling together my love of visualizing things in different ways and exploring my love of insect behavior. Now, I have a lot more to share with other examples, but my main goal here is to just give you some background, some ideas, and then to open up with questions to explore either some of those approaches and tailor fit this discussion to your needs, as well as, ideally, to take on your visualization challenges, either right now or collectively at the end. Please turn on your microphones and talk to me. Do you have questions? Would you like to explore some of those visualization approaches? Would you like me to tell more background? Or do you want to turn the discussion to challenges you're individually facing?
Thank you, Barrett. That was fantastic. And I'm happy to jump in with a question.
Yeah, please.
But I also don't want to dominate. So I want to invite anyone else who has a question to go first.
Oh my gosh, I bet Andrew Suarez has a question.
Except that he just logged in.
What?
I only just logged in. Sorry to miss it. I had a meeting that went till 11:30.
Hi, Andy. We
No problem.
recorded it. Don't worry.
Great.
Great
I
to
just
see you.
saw like the superstars presenting, so I wanted to catch part of it. Yeah.
Yay. Great to have you here.
I'm gonna go hide now.
All right. I love the ant poster. Others.
Hi, Barrett. A really fantastic presentation. I'm so excited that IUSSI sent a reminder email about this today. I guess something I've been super inspired by lately has been I'm in the Dornhouse lab at the University of Arizona, and we recently read Walter Schinkel's The Fire Ants.
Right.
And so, for a lot of us who work with these amazing ant systems that have really beautiful, intricate below ground nests, that kind of 3D visualization can be really great for science communication and research alike. But for me right now, I'm working with aphids, which are oftentimes just, little blobs that are on leaves. And I'm trying to sort of think about the best way to visually represent that, whether I could do something three-dimensional or if illustration really is the best way to go. And I'm wondering, in your experience, if there's a type of habitat or structure that lends itself particularly well to 3D versus 2D, one or the other.
Really great question. And this is coming from a person who does brilliant works in weavings and wearable Entimo art. So I had the pleasure of seeing some Meredith's works on display in Portland at the ESA meetings this November. So honestly, you pick the medium and you can make things work, including in terms of weaving. There are some artists who have effectively done fabric insects exquisitely in bas-relief or full 3D form. Now, I think that was really insightful of you to ask, is there essentially a medium that may work better for some subjects than other subjects? And yeah, you could argue yes. I struggled with visualizing aphids myself because Kevin Tougeron was in my lab for a while, and he introduced aphids and parasitoids into the lab, and we wanted to look at sleep behavior. We turned a thermal camera on them. We turned macro photography cameras on them, and sometimes we'd get some glorious images, but you're really looking at sessile, minute organisms, and that can be a challenge. So I would argue that better methods to visualize in not only in, and I should preface this with, what are our goals in scientific visualization? I'd say number one is to achieve accuracy when we convey or depict our scientific subjects. Two is clarity. So accuracy, clarity, and then aesthetics. If you can weave those together, you've got a brilliant product, an effective product. So if we're going to achieve accuracy, clarity, and aesthetics with aphids, you might consider something along the lines of an animation, an illustrated animation that shows what's happening with respect to, say, the pump, Siberial pump, and pulling up the phloem inside the proboscis. What's happening in the body? Are you working with, for example, symbionts, gut symbionts that are making tryptophan available? In that case, can you feature those symbionts? And the glory of working with different visualization techniques is that you can have artistic license. You can play with things. You can have inserts if it's a still image to blow up sections. You can have animations. If any of you watches the brilliant series of Deep Look, you can have the whole aphid and then zoom right in to the gut and part of the gut, and your audience will understand what's happening. So these are tricks that work, just as looking at a cartoon strip works for us because we say, there's a difference in terms of space and time. Playing with our spatial temporal senses through the convention of having, if you're in the Western Hemisphere, from left to right, a series of panels. So I've played with that before. A great example in a recent publication is Peter Cooper's Insectopolis, where he's doing what he always does brilliantly, and that's graphic novels or comic books or cartoons. And in that case, he's playing with insect behavior and cultural entomology. Annemieke Mein in Europe is one person who works, Meredith, you might be interested in weavings of insects. Glass can work brilliantly, but I wouldn't work with it, way too fragile. And paper mache you'd think would be really limiting until you see the most amazing works featured in the Berlin Natural History Museum, the Humboldt Museum, with enlarged insect models made by Schmidt from the 20s, 30s. We could go on.
No, thank you. That was super great and inspiring. I gotta say, I do a lot of scientific illustration as well, primarily in taxonomic papers, but I've been kind of avoiding teaching myself animation because I don't think I can get into that time suck, but maybe for the next 5 years of my PhD.
Or collaborate with someone. And you could have beautiful collaborations where the expert in a medium, coupled with you, the expert in aphid biology, can produce a work that would transcend what either one of you could produce.
I guess that's one of my next questions then, and I'm sorry this will be my last question.
No, it doesn't have to be, Meredith.
Here. But so for me as a knitwear designer, right, when people approach me with collaborative opportunities, there's a lot of, in my mind as an artist, that's like a material cost, a time cost, a design cost. When I'm trying to find collaborations, and this is why kind of like, I'm a one-woman show over here, how do you incentivize artists, especially picture yourself as a grad student with very limited funding to do so? How would you go about incentivizing someone to work with you on a project that might be wholly outside what they're doing? Is it just kind of like you find that perfect person, that like rare pearl, and you just have that amazing relationship?
Well, we could take this like a choose your own adventure. Do you have funding or do you not have funding? If you have funding, there are a lot of different ways to incentivize and approach that collaboration. If you don't have funding, then yes, you're limited, but there's still ways to entice collaborators. I'll give you I could give you a lot of case studies. I'll tell you how the faux frogs, those robotic frogs, came about. I heard a talk by Ryan Taylor in Mike Ryan's lab at UT Austin, and I was blown away. And during the talk, he said, "If only I could make a robotic frog." And so I went up to him after his talk and I said, "Well, I've made fake frogs before, and I've got a friend who makes robots, so we could make you a robotic frog." And he said, "You're hired," but he didn't have any money, right? So thankfully, I was a scientist, I am a scientist, and I love behavior. And so he invited me to be part of the scientific venture. So oftentimes you'll hear about, if you're into this, hear about the intersection of science and art at different entities around the world. And oftentimes it tends to be skewed, biased, where the artist is kind of hired by the scientist to visualize their science instead of having a two-way mutually beneficial exchange where the science can be influenced by the art and vice versa. So we were able to be part of the scientific process, which was especially exciting. We didn't need a dime save for material costs that came out of his grant and his budget, because we could be part of the scientific team, co-authors on publications, helping to make up, explore, have the intellectual investment as well as the tangible material investment of the RoboFrogs that allowed different new directions in otherwise impossible science to be conducted. Another way to approach it, and again, I'm thinking about that dichotomy of, can you pay the person or can't you pay the person? If you can pay the person, like my friend Damon Kylo, his whole life is about conveying science effectively as an artist who got a PhD in mycology and ecology, right? So he works off of oftentimes grant monies that can pay the broader outreach that might be built into grants. Am I going in a direction that's helpful, or do you want other examples that might be more helpful?
I don't know if I can speak for everyone here, but that's really helpful for me. So thank you.
Oh, sure. Also, believe it or not, there are artists who, and I don't like to promote doing art for art's sake and the starving artist without being paid. No, they should be recompensed, right? But there are artists who need less incentive for, I'd argue, a couple of reasons. One is if they really want to reach a specific audience. Now, I made a point of trying to pay artists who contributed to the images that ended up in the Insect Epiphany. At the very least, I had a copy of the book sent to them, and otherwise I'd try to pay them in different ways. And Elizabeth Jean Younce is a marvelous printmaker and artist based in Los Angeles. And I loved her work. I actually owned a work of hers that I had purchased in the past, and I wanted to entice her, even though she's a very busy person, to do the cover and several segment inserts, page-sized illustrations in the book. So I was able to pay her, but she really wanted to reach this audience of scientists. So that was really important to her. Another is if you've got a really talented up-and-coming illustrator or artist who just wants to get their work out there, maybe they can afford, arguably, to be paid at least less because they need the experience, they need the exposure. And then when they build this portfolio, now they can really charge more, right? So it's really important to not only highlight the artist behind works in publications, but it's important in some way to make it mutually beneficial in that collaboration.
Thank you, Barrett. I did notice there's a question in the chat. This was from Alyssa. How did you manage getting a PhD and illustrating a guide at the same time? And
well, my PhD took a little bit longer. But
maybe the larger question of how to manage, it kind of does raise a larger question about how to manage artistic pursuits and science communication pursuits when maybe that's, again, not what you're necessarily being paid or incentivized to do.
Right.
Your day
Well,
job.
part of the solution to that challenge is to make it what you do. Make it at the core of what you do. Make sure that what you're doing on a daily basis is your passion. And I love being a professor of entomology and animal behavior. Doesn't mean I like the grading, doesn't mean I like certain parts of it, but on the whole, it's an amazing life that allows me, at least in my position, to explore a variety of things. If I were at a different institution, I might not be able to explore as broadly, or I'd have to find more creative ways to explore more broadly. But when I say make it the core of what you do, I'm thinking about fellow grad students, Rochelle will know, who designed their PhDs in order to be able to travel the world. Okay. They really wanted to do that. So they made their topic, an easy foray to do that. With illustration, if you love to produce visualizations and you're good at it, or you want to train to get really good at it, make it the core of your work. Make the visuals at the center of your work. And there's some obvious ways to do that. For example, work in which you present a set of wasp faces, because wasps can distinguish status of those fellow colony members by their faces, right? So now it's a very visual venture at the core. Meredith's aphids are less inherently visually enticing, but that doesn't mean you can't make it or explore what to most people is a very tiny sessile green thing. Every organism is glorious in 1,001 ways. The way to tap into that can be more challenging for some subjects than other subjects. And one way to do that, and actually I mentioned Deep Look before. Meredith, if you haven't seen the Deep Look featuring aphids, you should, because wow, it's thrilling. It's thrilling. So if it's not at the core of what you do, then think about how you can most effectively disseminate your science. I showed Darwin his famous scribble, his doodle of that tree, that metaphor, that visual metaphor for evolution. And I showed the published version where he has multiple trees, thinking maybe there were multiple origins of life, and here's where some lineages went extinct, etc., to convey this idea, right? I lament the fact that Darwin only used one image. I think On the Origin of Species would have been far more effective had he included more visuals, and not gratuitously, but clearly, accurately, effectively. So
And
that
maybe
was
good writing as well.
Oh, I would argue with that. Now, there might have been
Oh.
excessive detail, but the brilliant rational buildup through chapters 1 through 3 to chapter 4 with natural selection as a workable means of evolution was, I think, brilliantly done. Now, maybe it doesn't play off as well today in contemporary writing, but at least how he presented the argument, I think, was really powerful and clear. So there were lost opportunities in terms of visuals there, right? We as scientists want to not only clearly convey our science and accurately convey our science, we want to effectively disseminate our science. And oftentimes that is done visually. Now, there are fascinating exceptions to that, which I'd be happy to explore with you. But if you're faced with a block of text versus a block of text complemented, and I'd say augmented with an effective visual, which one are you going to more passionately dive into? Which one are you going to read? Which one are you going to read more of? I was once part of an international journal club in a lab overseas. And in that journal club, what would we do? We'd take a paper, and the person who led this discussion would, interestingly, go through the figures, just the figures. What if it had been a paper without figures at all, right? Now, step that up. Do you limit yourself to alphanumeric columns and rows in the form of a table? Do you limit yourself to an XY plot? Or do you have a more intuitive, more enticing, potentially inspiring, less abstract visual? And that, in my mind, is the illustration done well, or some kind of video, sometimes a computer graphic. I am so happy that people are starting to be able to produce supplementary material animations where a honeybee neck you can take apart in pieces and see how they feature together. The third axillary scleroid of a wing is with associated contracting muscles now visible in a real way. So you see the folding that made insects dominant. So these kinds of tools are some of the most effective ways to communicate science to other scientists. And we could go into another discussion about broader outreach. How do you make that science not just an insular ivory tower venture, but something that reaches the masses? And that's what I wanted to do through the writing in a heavily visual-laden book, The Insect Epiphany. And that's what I'm trying to push for this sleep book as well.
I'd like to invite Sean or Rochelle or whoever would like to do their next question.
Yeah, so I just want to point out, I think there actually are at least two places where you can be encouraged and rewarded for building effective sharing of scientific information into your career. And I recognize, Barrett, I think you kind of intimated this. There may be institutions or programs that are more or less open to this. So I can't say it's universally true, but if grants are ever a thing again in our society, right? Right, the whole notion of broader impacts could absolutely involve these kinds of thoughts and efforts if done in a thoughtful way. I think there's ample room, and I've seen evidence of it being rewarded in broader impacts in grant reviews. And then even as part of your actual job, never mind, related to funding and NSF's interest in pursuing broader impacts. Universities are increasingly interested in interfacing effectively with the public. And I think that this partly comes from the fact that we're under siege, right? And that we have, academia has, come to recognize that if we're not getting our message out there effectively, we're going to be in more trouble than we're already in. And I think all the things that you're talking about, Barrett, are really wonderful ways of doing this that many of us can pursue. And so I actually do think there is room for melding your creative interests and talents into your actual work, and not have it be something that we need to view as just layered on top or quote you do in your spare time. So.
Well put, Sean. And just a couple, I want to take this in so many different directions. I'll just pick one. If you have, for example, you can have the media approach you to report on a discovery you've made, or you can reach out to the media yourself. It can be very local. I've found that the La Crosse Tribune doesn't have, somebody's going to listen in, doesn't have much to publish, right? So they really want scientists, they really want people to. So I've written a couple of articles, and they were fun. They were about the periodical cicada boom, right? Things like that, in a way that's really accessible, that people say, wow, these insects are fascinating in ways that I would have never guessed, right? So you can reach out to various media outlets. I keep a list, or in my email, like, oh yeah, there are these several journalists who told me, and they wouldn't say this if they didn't mean it. Listen, if you know of work that could be really exciting to write about, whether it's your own or others, please contact me. That's an invitation, right? And if you get that invitation or you pursue that yourself, which I highly recommend, and it can be locally, it can be through your university website. Um, uh, People love writing about activities that are happening at your university, for example. What I recommend doing is always inviting the journalist for you to fact check. And I'd use the fact check, right? Because if you want to edit, no. And there's some media outlets that will not allow their subjects to look at the works before they're published or before they're available online, for example. There's some that just, they won't do that, like Science Friday, they won't do that, right? But there are others that welcome that. And wow, have I been able to correct a whole bunch of errors? Because invariably, there's going to be at least one error and more likely multiple errors. And to have that opportunity to tell your story accurately and clearly is, there's no surrogate for that. And a good example, I said, hey, I'd be happy to fact check, and so they sent it to me. And I said, actually, and I rewrote a portion, they used my rewritten portion. Someone wrote a book that featured some of my research, And that author sent it my way, and I just reread, and that author was really happy about that and just took it, right? Because I wrote it more accurately and clearly than that person had in that person's attempt, right? So don't be shy about that, because you know your science better than anybody else knows your science.
Thank you. This is great discussion. I am going to invite anyone who needs a 5-minute break to take that. That said, we can continue questions through the 5 minutes for anyone who wants to stay on. So we will start with Kaitlin's presentation in about 5 minutes.
Yeah. And I don't need that 5-minute break. So if anybody has questions or thoughts that you want to share, because I've been talking a lot, but it'd be wonderful to hear your triumphs or your struggles. And I know, Rochelle, you have a question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if we can do this in 5 minutes, but basically my question, and this is I have a couple students on, and this is for them to think about with me. We're about to start drafting a paper that is going to talk about a very complex symbiotic species network.
Great.
And I have done this for a while, you know, for my career. You and I both have been in the fungus growing ant realm, and so we, you know, there's lots of ways to do that. And I've done this by layering in PowerPoints. I've done this by hiring Damon. But my question is, and I'm thinking about the figure you showed where you were illustrating some behavior alongside data. I mean, how can we, or do you have any suggestions of, here we've got this very complicated story. We want all symbiotic species, you know, featured in our illustration, but we don't want to write a full page of caption to explain it. Like, you know, where is that balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a case by case scenario. Just how complex can you get? And, or how, let's put it the other way, how simple can you make it? What can you pare down? What can you strip from the complexity and still be honest when you're telling the story, right? And that's a tricky one. And actually, that's something I love to work on, thinking about how, one, are you telling a story where it's a food web where you have a billion connections, a network diagram that's just overwhelming just to say it's overwhelming? Okay, you know, that's fine to overwhelm if you want, if that's your message, that it's overwhelming, right? If you want to make it really useful, uh, there are ways through, and it would be supplementary materials, hyperlinking, for example, where you can have layered diagrams. Like imagine bodily systems of the human body. Well, there's your skeletal system, and now you overlay the muscular system. Now you overlay circulatory, you know, and so you go through that and you see, oh, all these beautiful layers. I have a book, popular book, where you wear anaglyphic glasses, and when you look through one eye versus the other eye, you see the different layers of anatomy or different organisms pop up. So there are tricks you can do depending on what medium you're using, right? But if you're talking about the staid, conventional, constrained, two-dimensional, peer-reviewed figure, then we're talking about something different. Now, you can always have that two-dimensional figure that's simplified, that shows just a few connections in a cohesive, brilliant way, and then link to supplementary materials, layered, more complex versions of that. And that could be a really fascinating exploration, not only artistically, but scientifically. Because people oftentimes dismiss or downplay the efficacy of using visualization to find, for hypothesis generation, for data mining, for coming up with novel ideas, to find patterns. So when you start breaking it down, maybe that could be a really good exercise for your students to see what is the bare bones that will tell the simple message, if you can tell a simple message, to tell that simple message. And now what can I add that would not detract from egregiously from the clarity, from the accuracy, from the aesthetics? And honestly, I'd love to look at, and if you can share something now, I'd love to look at just how many connections you're making and what you feel are the most important connections. And you know, Rochelle, the diagrams that connect with thicker, broader lines and arrows, suggesting greater contributions, you know, in food webs and life cycles and all those kinds of things, right? So you can play with abstractions coupled with the more intuitive imagery of the players, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like fungi, bacteria,
Yeah.
predators, fungal mutualist, social parasite, host.
Yeah.
Um,
Actually, what about having a two-page spread or one that leads into another? You could have a really novel, interesting visual that would capture people's attention.
yeah.
And I'd love to come back to this. I just want to take this opportunity to say that if you think that just because the journal that publishes articles does it a certain way is limited to that way, think again. At least some journals and some journal editors would love to have more interesting, more inspiring visuals that deviate from the norm. And I played with this a couple of times. One example, I have a master's student named Bug, and Bug Hartsock does fun cartoons. In fact, here are a couple of his zines, like one on Apiliones, another on To Love a Wasp, right? And they're hilarious and they're really informative. Um, these are great outreach ventures. I know people who give zines out for free, just on the subway, for example, right? Well, I enlisted Bug, paid Bug, to do a page size cartoon for a peer-reviewed article that that I wrote with a spider biologist thinking about how to apply Tinbergen's levels of analysis to invite or inspire behavioral researchers to consider sleep in their organisms if they don't already. And so having the cartoon, I felt, was a fun way, an inviting way to bring them in. Now, that's risky. Was it successful? I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea. I haven't heard enough feedback from people, but it was a fun venture, right?
Barrett, thank you. This is too good, and I have to be the police here because we
Yeah,
could talk forever. Thank you so much.
of course.
And we will take more questions after the second speaker gets a chance to talk. So great conversation, great questions. Keep them going. But now we're going to turn it over to Kaitlin. So just a quick introduction. So our second speaker is Dr. Kaitlin Baudier. Kaitlin is an assistant professor at the School of Biological and Environmental Earth Sciences at the University of Southern Mississippi. Received her bachelor's in biology from Louisiana State University and PhD in biological sciences from Drexel University. Did postdoc work at the Social Insect Research Group at Arizona State. She's currently PI of the Social Insect Science Lab at USM, where she studies comparative physiology, behavior, and functional ecology of lots of social insects, bees, ants, wasps, and is also very dedicated to the communication of social insect science, very active in participation in a lot of educational and outreach events. Also has the unique distinction of serving for 2 years as entomologist of the Audubon Insectarium. So I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today. I'm hoping we will. And also has done work in digital and traditional illustration and photography, which has been featured in textbooks, publications, and even comic books. And so you can check that out at USMSocialInsectLab.com. Thank you so much, Kaitlin. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. All right. How is the presentation showing up? Are you able to see it?
Double click. Oh, here we go. It's good now.
Oh, okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about tables. Yes, these interesting props that were offered to work with at a lot of events where we're expected to communicate to the public. Trials, tribulations, and some possible suggestions and solutions. I'm excited to talk to all of you about this, in part because I'm curious to hear all of your experiences, because I actually think this is a situation that maybe most, if not all of us, have faced at one point or another when interfacing with the public about any topics in which we are trying to provide information on. As a quick disclaimer, I'm going to talk about lots of places I've worked in the past and places I currently work, and everything I'm going to express is my opinion and not the opinion representative of those organizations. So as Amy mentioned, I am currently at the University of Southern Mississippi, where I'm a PI of a social insect research lab. And yes, we have a variety of different model organisms. Mostly we work with ants, stingless bees, some subsocial beetles, and facultatively eusocial paper wasps as well. But I like to really show for a minute the stars of that show, which are the students that I work with. Shout out especially to Karen and Kristen, my very first graduate students who plan to defend in 2026. Other outreach-related hats that I wear at my university include co-organizing a relatively new research experience for undergrads that focuses on Gulf coastal plain ecology. So I'm going to give that a shameless plug in case there's anybody out there who knows an undergraduate student just trying to get their first research experience in. We've got a bunch of entomologists on our team here. This is a paid summer experience. But we also have herpetologists, botanists, general ecologists. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to scan that QR code, or if you have access to the PDF of this that should be up on the website maybe later, you can click that little blue link. That's not the only thing I do at USM that's service learning related, though. I work with a teacher's conservation workshop in the summers, where different school teachers from around Mississippi come to this facility that we have that's actually a outdoor facility that's open to the public on the weekends called Lake Throw Environmental Center. And these teachers, we teach them about how to tackle topics within each of our expertises. And one thing that's really cool is that starting this year, I've started a service learning course, general zoology, that is designing exhibits to help anyone who comes through that facility, the Lake Throw Environmental Center, learn about some of the animal collections that we have housed at Lake Throw. And so I just wanted to, because they've just completed these assignments this week, give them a quick shout out. Only one section of this large course could fit in a photo at a time, but here you can see about a third of them, and some of the exhibits that they made that were about some of the insects in our animal collections here. Yeah. And of course, like many of you, another outreach-related role that I play on campus is to attend university recruitment events and communicate with the public about the research that goes on in my department, and especially in my lab, which of course focuses on social insects. But before I was in academia, I had a kind of different job. Before I went to grad school at Drexel in Sean O'Donnell's lab, shout out to Sean and lab who are there now. I was actually a full-time public educator. My official title that I put on my tax forms was traveling entomologist and bug chef. And that relates to the nature of the Audubon Insectarium, as it was called back then. Now the Audubon Insectarium and Butterfly Garden, which is a huge facility in New Orleans, which at the time when it was constructed in 2006, which was the largest freestanding American museum dedicated to insects and only insects. Well, I say that there are a few spiders in there. And some of the stuff that you would learn about in the insectarium included not only living insects and fossilized insects, but also entomophagy, or the consuming of insects as a sustainable food for humans. And so that's what you can see my colleague Mac Cuenca talking about in the top left there. So that's where the bug chef came in. But where does the traveling come in? I was one of two staff who, with my post-baccalaureate, status, basically curated and on the weekends ran exhibits with live people in them interacting with the public. This traveling exhibit, funded partially by Terminix, called Harry's Big Adventure: My Bug World. And this traveling exhibit moved around from children's museums and science museums all over the country, from Baltimore to Memphis, Little Rock, here, there, and everywhere. And so it was a fantastic experience moving around through all of these spaces, getting to talk to people in all these different parts of the country with the same sorts of talking points, talking tools, and talking topics that were of an entomological nature. Since then, of course, in academia, I've had other experiences. When I was a graduate student, I talked at the Philadelphia Science Fair, which is a big public family event. In the bottom right, you can see a photo of that back in 2015. When I was a postdoc, we tabled at the Phoenix March for Science and talked to the general public there. And of course, at the Insectarium, I had standing places where I would be talking to the public 24/7 when I wasn't or not 24/7, but 5 days a week when I wasn't traveling. And then in the bottom left, you can see the Crosby Arboretum, amazing Bug Fest event. They have a bug fashion show in which people dress as moths and beetles, inspired by real species, and learn about them. I just love that. But what do all of these things have in common, right? These are all different venues that maybe some of you have experienced trying to interface with the public. They're all full of tables, these physical dividers that stand between you and the public, right? That physically separate you, and I think have a really important effect on how we think about information flow. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that today. All right, so first of all, what are the goals of public outreach? Well, we usually want to inspire people. We want to educate them or inform them on specific topics that we think maybe are really important to know about for them, for your specific target audience. We want to foster curiosity, right? Open doors to careers that maybe people didn't realize they had a propensity for. And it is also their expectation of us that we entertain them. I'm not just saying that out of nowhere. We actually did a poll of thousands of people who came through the Insectarium's doors, and we had a list of different things that they wanted to get out of their experience, and way and far above all of the rest was entertainment. First and foremost, people come to these things on the weekends, especially these public events that are for families, to entertain themselves and their kids. And so while we may consider the other things on that list highest priority, we have to keep their needs in mind as well. But there are a lot of challenges for doing this with this clunky structure that you're presented with at a lot of these events as the unspoken default prop for speaking to the public. First of all, it can be really hard to see over a table if you're not a terribly tall person. Take a look at this photo at that same Bug Fest event that I mentioned earlier, and look at this toddler. His head is about the height of that table. And as you can see, he's not looking at anything that everybody else in the group is looking at because he can't see it. Tables are sometimes full of unclear expectations for what interactions should look like. Right? If you go to a counter in a grocery store, you kind of have learned culturally that what you should do is put your things you want to buy up there, and then your expectation of that person is to scan them and tell you what it costs, and then you hand them your form of payment and say thank you and leave. But when expectations for interactions over countertops are unclear, it can be awkward, and sometimes people are reluctant to walk up, especially if maybe they feel a little intimidated. also relating to the visibility thing I mentioned earlier, you've got to talk to different age groups at the same time at many of these events. Sometimes you're lucky and it's something targeted to a specific group and you know exactly the sorts of things you're going to say. But oftentimes you're trying to talk to, a tall parent and a little kid at the same time. And you have to find a way to balance that. These, complications are made further complicated by the fact that oftentimes tabling events are crowded and you have lots of tables, lots of people speaking loudly over one another. And so these are distraction-rich environments. Oftentimes there's also poor traffic flow through these areas. And so I wanted to kind of tackle these topics head on. Just first of all, talking about some of the challenges that I've seen, and then telling you about some of the solutions or tentative solutions I've come up with. But I really encourage you to kind of reserve comments for the end for solutions or problems that you see as well, because I think this is a fantastic opportunity of shared experiences for us as educators in one form or another, many of us. But let's start by talking about the visibility problem of tables. All right, so we saw that, toddler that couldn't see over the table, even though there was a very nice person dressed as a crawfish there wanting to talk to him in a very charismatic way. What are some possible solutions for that type of scenario, right? One that I really love is to lower the table. Here you can see this is a lower table. This is actually at the Phoenix March for Science tabling event. Zach Schaefer just, I think, left the legs in and just put it on some boxes so that it would be a more appropriate height for people of shorter stature. And it's nice because it wasn't on the ground, so nothing was going to be at risk of being stepped on, but then everybody could see over the top more comfortably. And yeah, having about knee height was just about right. And for height reference of what that looks for, I'm 5'4". And if you're wondering what I'm doing with my hands, I would think I was talking about dynasties, because they have a prenodal spine in one of their head. Anyway, don't always talk with my hands, but when I do, it's about dynasties, I guess. Another option is to provide steps, right? I will say there's a caveat to that, which is that steps, especially if they're tall, people can trip over and fall off of. But there are a lot of really good, like Montessori type towers that you can get that have better railings or holding on the side options to make for a little bit more equitable height experience. Another option that you don't need equipment for is to not use the table, right? Or maybe use the table as a prop stand behind, but then walk around in front. Oftentimes, if I have a very young child who wants to touch something, pet an insect, I'll walk around the front of the table and I'll crouch down and I'll say, would you like to pet this insect? Of course, getting the parents' permission first. And usually that works a lot better, not just because, the height is correct, but because it allows me to get on the same eye level as a person who is a different height than myself, right? And in addition to, walking around the table, standing on the side of the table to make that feel more natural. You could just get rid of the table entirely if you like. I've seen a lot of really cool tabling things, especially ones that are geared at very young kids, have fun activities and props. Like I think the Orleans Parish mosquito board had a dip net station where you could pick up like plastic mosquito larvae in a kiddie pool with a net. It was very fun. So those are options to think about as well. All right, let's take a moment to talk about expectations for interactions and how you can make those a little bit more clear. Some things that I've encountered and solutions that work for me. All right, so you're standing there behind your table. Maybe the first visitors walk in and everybody's just awkwardly avoiding eye contact with each other because nobody wants to be the first one to say something. Right? It's a common situation, especially early in the day where maybe you've got like 12 tables worth of people staring at the first two visitors. The best thing you can do in that situation, I found for me anyway, is to take the initiative and start the conversation. One really nice part about this is if you lead with a question, you give the visitor the opportunity to say no thank you if it's something that doesn't appeal to them and they can move on to another table without pressure, right? But then you can also set the tone for what the table is about very quickly, right? So for instance, I might say to someone walking up to our table at this event that I'm showing those example tables from the first slide about, hey, would you like to talk about the new moth exhibits that we have at Lake Thoreau? Look, I've got all these moths for you to take a look at if you want to, right? And they can say yes or no to that. Or perhaps I could say, hey, have you ever seen an ant that looks like this? Because if you have, this is a new exotic species in this area, and we would like to know, right? And so really quickly, you've communicated to the public what an appropriate way to interact with you is, that their feelings on the matter are valued, and what your table's about in general, right? I also want to emphasize that with your verbal interactions, it's really important to validate the visitor. Oftentimes, people are nervous about expressing thoughts, especially adults, because they don't want to be seen as unintelligent or ill-informed. They want to know more, but they don't know where to start, right? And so when somebody says something interesting, just share the excitement of that, right? And also let them lead the conversation. That really helps get talks going too. Don't just have a, unidirectional monologue planned. It oftentimes you won't get to the end of it. People will walk away or something like that. There are also some really important things to think about with physical interaction expectations, right? Sometimes I find it's useful to have a touch and don't touch area, or just plan to have everything on my table touchable or everything not touchable, because that helps people, especially kids, understand what is and isn't appropriate. And it helps their parents not chastise them for doing something that's actually good, right? If a parent's not paying attention and they suddenly see their kid grabbing something off a table, they might say, no, no, no. But if you say, hey, would you like to come over and touch this? Or would you like a free bracelet or something like that? That avoids any awkwardness like that. And it's also really important to respect boundaries when they're communicated. No, I don't want to touch that, or I wouldn't like to walk over the table, but also to set your own boundaries and enforce them as well, right? One that often comes up if you have touchables, such as the subsocial beetles that we oftentimes bring to events, is people want to hold them. And sometimes they become afraid mid-holding an insect and may or may not reflexively fling said insect. So as a policy for our lab, we don't allow people to hold things, but they can pet them. But sometimes people don't understand why that is, and you don't need to explain it to them, but you do need to enforce that boundary if you're going to have it, right? So if a kid says, I want to hold it and bring it over there to show my dad, I'll say, you can't hold it, but you can pet it. Or if somebody's grabbing or petting too hard, you can say, please just use one finger or something like that. Now let's talk about communicating to different age groups. This was the biggest challenge that I faced, especially on a really busy day while I was working at a public education facility. And it took me a lot of mistakes to come up with what I have so far. I'm really curious to hear your ideas as well. All right, so this is definitely not an AI family. It definitely is. But in any case, let's take this scenario, right? You've got an entomologist and you're faced with multiple kids, multiple adults, all in one happy family, and they all want to learn something, right? And so the entomologist may, one person choose to start talking to one individual over the other, or answer one question for a long period of time before, they move on to the other person's questions. But the truth of the matter is, oftentimes, especially in family groups, when a person's feeling ignored, that can lead to some negative behaviors that can be mitigated if you get the mixed age group communication just right. And what do I mean by these negative behaviors? Well, oftentimes they're attention seeking. And for a little kid, that might be interrupting inappropriately, to shout things that are unrelated. Or something I often see is, especially if the table's too tall, they start slapping stuff on the table because they don't know what to do with their hands, right? And they want to do something. Interestingly, they're often attention-seeking behaviors in adults that are not ideal, that in some ways are not all that dissimilar from those of children, right? Oftentimes adults will interrupt if you're talking to a kid, if they feel like they're ignored and they want an education experience they're not getting. Sometimes, and this is surprisingly common, you'll see a parent sneak up behind the kid and try to scare them as they're about to touch something or look at an insect to try and put the focus back on them, right? Another really, big problem are disparaging comments that come out when adults feel ignored. Is this even a real job? Or I just kill insects with fire or something like that. These are all, they tend to be attention-seeking adult behaviors. So how do we avoid those? How do we prevent them before they even happen? By making sure everyone's getting an enriching communication experience. Well, one really effective method that I have found is to find common ground. What can an adult and a child and everyone experience that they'll enjoy? One is asking someone to sense something, right? What color is this? All right, put your hand on this. How does it feel? Oh, you want to taste a chocolate chip cookie? How does it taste? Can you listen to this beetle? What sound is it making? Everyone enjoys that, right? Everyone who can talk will enjoy something like that. And validate those experiences. That's very important. Another technique you can use if you have multiple people who are tabling with you is to split the difference. Talk with your coworker and say, hey, for the next hour, do you mind if I talk to the kids and you talk to the adults? You can even spatially separate them a little bit. So you have some stuff on one side of the table that's more adult appropriate and the other that's more kid appropriate. Or if you don't have another person, you can take turns, right? Switch back and forth between talking to kids and parents. This is the trickiest one. And if you take too long, then you start getting some of those attention-seeking behaviors. All right, another challenge to doing that is you have to do it while talking over a lot of other sounds or dealing with things that might be really entertaining happening behind you or in that person's line of sight. Some really good possible solutions I've seen to this, for this, some of which may or may not be available to you, are spacing out your tables as much as possible. I chose the two images on the right from New Orleans Bug Fest 2025 because I thought they were great examples of this. They had a field to work with and a parking garage, and since the weather was good, they ended up just spacing the tables way out. So nobody was shouting over each other, and there were actually visual separators in the parking garage by way of these columns that allowed groups of people to really pick which table they were talking to and to have crowds assemble at one table without preventing access to another table. Also, you want to avoid putting your table up if you can in front of highly distractible things behind you. One way you can do that if you don't have control over that is by putting up a barrier to the line of sight behind your table, right? So it could be there's another table behind you facing the opposite way, especially younger people, sometimes kids, get distracted. If something moves behind your table, they look at that. At the Bug Fest event in Picayune in the bottom left, we found that a major issue was that there was a body of water right behind us and a big sign that said feed the ducks and had like a coin machine with food you can throw at the ducks. And if we had that just behind us, then the kids would shout at that while the parents were asking information, and then the parents would go running towards a body of water with the kids after the kids. So one thing we did was we just got a banner to put behind us that actually acted as a great sun shield in the afternoon too. You can see two students in my lab sitting there behind the performer dressed as a Luna moth. And lastly, traffic flow can be a major issue in these types of environments. I'm going to show you a picture from the insectarium it was a daily conversation I had to have with people. And I think this is really fascinating study in human psychology. So this is the field camp station, as we called it. This is our old facility. This doesn't exist anymore. They built a new one in 2021. But you won't be able to see where Lonnie was sitting, our educator I showed you earlier at that table, because there's a crowd formed around her. But it's back in that left corner, kind of underneath the butterfly trap. And then we have this open area with the chrysalis hanging over it and a random stanchion. If you don't know what a stanchion is, those are those two poles with the band in between you see at the movie theater. That has to be there because of safety, fire safety. There has to be an evacuation route that's unimpeded by physical structures that people can run through in the case of a fire in the building. And on the other side of those doors behind the chrysalis is an emergency fire escape, and those doors open automatically in a fire. Well, that is also the very end of the museum, right before the gift shop. And the field camp station is right at the beginning of the loop that was the museum. So the idea was somebody could duck into this little crevice, learn about things at field camp, or if they didn't want to, keep walking down and get the whole loop of the museum. But when I tell you, it was a daily occurrence that people would see people laughing towards the gift shop and going into there through that stanchion and say, why can't I go over there? Right? I want to be over there. Why are you stopping me? I just paid admission. It was an interesting phenomenon that happened. But then we had other places where there was a slightly dark area or a curtain, and people were encouraged to go through there, and they didn't want to. So lighting, this was a very well-lit area. People were laughing and having fun on the other side. And so people saw these types of barriers as constricting and anxiety-inducing. So avoid stanchions. Curtains are great visual barriers that people really respect better than that, and they're really easier than a stanchion to run through in the case of an emergency. Yeah, that's one issue, is creating your visual space. But you can also let visitors know when they've been at your table long enough, and when it's time to move on, as some people, maybe stay a long time and build up, by pointing out something really cool that they might like at another exhibit in the space that you're in. And so it can be really beneficial for that reason to get kind of like a layout idea when you first arrive and you're setting up, so that you can tell people other things at other tables they might be interested in too. Okay, and that's all I've got for you. I think it would be really cool at this point to jump over and hear about all of your experiences, your thoughts, your questions, your challenges on tabling in this format for science communication as well. So even though it says questions here, don't feel like you only have to direct them to me. I kind of have one for you. Do you find similar issues, and do you have your own solutions?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kaitlin. A lot of that really resonated with some of my experience, and I'm sure others as well. Yeah, so anyone want to jump in with the first question? Barrett.
Yeah, I was talking with an arachnologist this past year, and she despises poster sessions, just hates them. And I was curious why, because, sometimes there's some beautiful posters, sometimes they're engaging discussions by those who produce the posters, and she hated them on every level. And one of the reasons was because you're obligated to talk to that person if they reel you in. And I really liked your insightful comments about how to engage but not overwhelm. Like, how do you ask that question to get a response, because it can be a very uncomfortable circumstance where you feel obligated to spend time in front of that one poster when you really want to see a dozen others, right? And so I was thinking about that when you talked about purposefully spacing out tables, because I could see the value in spacing out the tables, but I also see a problem where, are you going to go way over to that table where you're going to be all the more obligated to spend more time there? What do you think?
I think the format of a poster presentation is a fascinating study in human psychology as well. But really different expectations for interaction, right? Because we're all scientists, most of the people in that session have either given a poster presentation or been to one before, although there are a lot of people in many cases who maybe are going to their first conference. And I do think that's fantastic. The issues, if I could make that list for poster presentations that I would put in bold and make 10 times the font size or traffic flow, and loud, distraction-rich environment, right? I really love being really conversational personally with my posters as much as I can, because I think in order to give a really effective poster presentation, I have to get to know my audience a little. And that's one major advantage poster presentations have over talks, is that you can have that back and forth and break the ice and talk to someone a little bit before you get started. And I don't know. I think it's also great because you can try talking about the same topic, if you're lucky, a bunch of different times on the same day and see what works best. I wish I could say something all-encompassing about that, but I think you're absolutely right. A lot of these issues do come into us communicating our science to other scientists in poster sessions as well.
Thank you. That brings up an interesting point. And, I thought about this with poster sessions, and I've actually tried this a few times. If someone comes up and they are interested in your poster, but like Barrett said, sometimes they want to see 12 other posters too. And maybe this can work in a table setting. Do you want the 1-minute version, or do you want the long version? Because sometimes people just want a little taste of what you're offering. And other times that's what they came for. They really are into a certain thing. And, what's the harm in asking them before you even launch into your spiel about what it is that they're looking for? So I'm wondering if you've tried that, Kaitlin, and if that could be effective.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think almost always in both settings, shorter is better. It's just one of those phenomena that when you think you're being brief, you're not. Anytime you're anxious, it's much longer than you think. So that's actually really key in talking to mixed audiences as well, is that making sure that you're meeting everyone's needs. I've learned a lot about that, honestly, in trying to study for job interviews and how much there is actually about validating the person who's asking you the questions and realizing we can actually apply that into most interactions and have a more positive experience. And let me just be clear, all of this isn't just about you meeting your objectives that are, to unidirectionally flow information. But in all of my years of talking to the public, I think I'm a fairly approachable person, so maybe this helps. I've heard the most interesting, off-the-wall, thoughtful comments that really made me think about my science. And one of the major incentives we should have as scientists in talking to the public is to hear those amazing ideas that aren't entrenched in the dogma that we are, in all the same papers we've read. And I'm always hearing such novel, interesting things, sometimes from the youngest minds you wouldn't expect. A little kid once came up to me and just said, like, "Excuse me, what does a bee's esophagus look like?" That's a real thing that happened. So when you're talking about the disassemblable bee neck, I'm like, oh my gosh, she would have loved that. And I'm like, hang on a minute, because, at that time, this was my full-time job. I was like, I think we have a dead one frozen. Do you want to dissect it with me? And then she takes a look at the esophagus and she's like, okay, good. And like walks away. But then there were 10 other kids in the area who were like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, she wanted to know what an esophagus looks like. And so this is how we find out when we need to know. And then the room was full of all of these other people of various ages who are just getting a real kick out of that. And so I think there's something really worth doing about following someone else's train of thought, even when you're there to teach and educate. Oh, Rochelle, I think your hand's up.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Something that struck me, so we also do quite a bit of outreach. I love the suggestion of moving the table down to a lower height. But we do have a petting zoo. So we have a teddy bear ant. And so we have individuals that are, holding a little tiny fuzzy ant. And we have a lingering problem, because sometimes the little girls are just, they just won't put it down. So this idea of segregating your table, the touch and the don't touch. But also, I mean, can you speak more about any sort of kind of interactions with like corralling those that want to linger, or somehow, because I don't want to discourage that connection. I mean, they're really, really enjoying it, but at the same time, there's a traffic flow problem. Can you talk about, I guess, maybe traffic flow?
Yeah, traffic flow is a complicated one because people are really variable in like the ways they want it to be communicated to them that it's time to move on. And then there are some people who are like, well, I don't want to hear that. So sorry, I will live here now and forever. And so sometimes when I actually get someone like this, one effective method that I have found is asking them to talk to the next person in line. Because sometimes I get the impression that this person kind of wants to maybe show off what they know. And if I kind of suss out the information they've got, I'm like, hey, you know, this person's afraid to pet this, but you said you had a nice experience. Why don't you tell them what it was like? You know? And then it's kind of like peer encouragement in a way. So instead of me trying to talk to a whole bunch of people, I can divide labor a little bit in that way. If I've got someone who's a talker, let's let them talk, let's let them shine. And then if it's a conversation among three people, that's not so bad. We've all done that before, you know. And I actually think sometimes you can also poll the audience, use your like big lecture voice sometimes when you've got a whole bunch of people who arrive at once. You're like, okay, show of hands, who loves Beatles? Okay, show of hands, who's like, nope, 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 nope. Okay, you want to move this way? If you're like a nope, 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 we've got a table where you can touch some things that are like, it feels like the Beatle, but it's not a live Beatle. Yeah, and then if you want to come back here afterwards, then you can, if you change your mind, you know. And I think giving people the option to opt out of any experience protects from a lot of those potential flinging situations, which are worst case scenario, usually, right? Yeah. Any other questions?
Sean's hand is up, or Sean's.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sean, hi.
Yeah. Hey, I want to come back to the, I don't know if this is really something for us to address. Maybe if we're in a position to participate in the design of these kinds of events, right? You know, I would guess most of us are not likely to be, quote, the organizer, right? But I really find you're, you know, thinking carefully about placement and spacing of exhibits to be very, very powerful. And this is something I think does 100% also apply to poster sessions. Although I am also a hater of posters, so I don't want to get into that too much. Let's focus on tables and exhibits. So I think that there's a big problem at many of these events of too much. And I think the idea that maybe less is more is something that we need to have built into how these events, right, are put together. Because the one that is, you know, closest to home here at Drexel, right in Philly, is the so-called Bug Fest, right, that the Academy runs, and it's outdoors, which is great, but it is like a poster session. It was like table, everything's right. And it just almost inevitably is going to lead to a lot of the kinds of problems, Kaitlin, that you're talking. It's almost like makes them happen, which I think is very unfortunate. And I just wonder, you know, to what extent can we like give feedback or feed forward or whatever to event organizers to think about maybe if we had, you know, 10 tables instead of 25, we would actually have better engagement and better information flow. I just think it's an interesting issue.
I think those are absolutely the right questions to be asking when designing these kinds of things. I think how many tables is good? Where will people feel inclined to walk? And I think that walking through it, kind of like, you know, what Temple Grandin did in the cattle shoots, right? And looking at what people are looking at, that they're going to be drawn to next, and what seems scary, right, is really important. Because that will help you predict what people are going to do. I also think there's something to be said for thinking of all of that and how well it works as a function of the number of people in the area. We did something at the Insectarium, which again was like a very, you know, canalized system with some offshoots for optional things people could pass by or stop and do. It was a full loop, right? And we clocked people entry and exit on days that were slow and on our heaviest days where we had maybe 2,000 school groups go through. And we found that on those busiest days, excluding the people who made the short cut through field camp and just went to the gift shop and left, those are outliers. That there was a difference in like over an hour and a half for how long people spent.
Wow.
Right?
That's
so
amazing.
part of that is also when you have school groups and you have overly strict chaperones that are like, don't touch anything, don't stop. And you have kids that just start running faster and faster, right? By the time they leave the museum, it's almost a full sprint. And I think that some things that are good for managing crowds, maybe and getting them out of there efficiently can be nice for regulating flow, but they're not nice for giving everyone an experience that's quality when it's crowded. And so I think those are all things that, are worth thinking about. How do we get people to slow down maybe when the system's moving too fast? Maybe we need more turns and more circuitousness, right? Maybe we need people to get a little bit more distracted by something nearby and stick for a second. But, that being said, on days where there's high volume, that can create bottlenecks as well. There's so much there
Kaitlin,
that's
sorry to interrupt. Just a related question. Did you have a docent that would actually assist with traffic flow? Because that seems like a job that no one ever does, and he could help, or at least like, would you like to go to the next station or something if they notice, because sometimes there's a popular one and a less popular one. And do you recommend that?
We had two different types of employees at the insectarium. Well, one was a type of employee, and the others were amazing volunteers. And we especially solicited volunteers on days that were going to be really busy to have more impromptu stations for talking to people and kind of relieve the pressure on the regular folks, and educators that could give breaks to people that are badly needed in the middle of the day so people can eat and drink, and for the entomologists go back and curate the exhibits as well, since that was also part of our job.
Yeah, so maybe just having some built-in floaters or something at these events could really...
It's true. And honestly, if you're somebody who's looking for opportunities to get involved and talk to people about what there are a lot of facilities like this who would love for an entomologist, a grad student, a PhD to go just be like, hey, my museum, I hear you have an event. Do you want an extra, expert to talk to the public? We loved it at the Insectarium. It was amazing to have people like that. Barrett.
How do you deal with death and questions of why are there all these dead bugs? Who killed them? Why'd you kill them?
That is a good question. And I've heard the questions asked a few different kinds of ways. And so to me, they're in their distinct categories about motivation that I typically saw with them. There's oftentimes older gentlemen would come in and say, so if I lit this on fire, would it sting itself to death? Or I killed this, I just stomped on it. Those types of comments, right? And so that's one branch. And then there's the other one, which I think is the one you're interested in, where people think, was it ethical for us to have killed this insect? Mm-hmm. And I think being open and honest about that conversation, generally so far for me, has yielded the best results. So I could be like, this one died naturally. You see how it's all beaten up? It lived a long life. See how its wings are like this? So we didn't kill this one. It died naturally. Or this one in the museum that looks really beautiful, it was euthanized for the purposes of this exhibit. I think instead of shying away from that topic, I've had the best conversations from diving into that. What do you think is an ethical reason to kill an insect? What do you think? Where would the line be? Have you killed insects before? Oh, well, how about these scenarios? Let's talk about it. What do you think? Because I think this is a really important learning opportunity, not just for the person you're talking to, but for us as well.
Yeah, I've had an outreach event outdoors and lots of kids and families. And there was one person in the back who said, don't you know that there are insect declines? And how can you display all these dead insects? And here you have an insect net. And so I tried to explain the power and value of a natural history repository for understanding declines and things like that. She marched off. It was really interesting. I hadn't faced that before, but of course, other just questions. Did you collect all these, or why were these killed? You know, these kinds of things pop up all the time for me.
That's really true. And I think it comes back to something I mentioned earlier about validating people's experiences. A lot of times when people say things, especially adults, and especially when it's the same suite of things, they're looking to be validated, to have you say that is the right question to ask and it's a good question. And oftentimes, they won't be able to take in anything you're saying until they feel that validation. Because they've worked hard to collect that question. Thank you.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a really important psychologically motivated response. I like that.
but I think that, you know, some things you're not going to agree with, like someone who comes up and tells you they kill all the snakes on their property because they hate snakes.
Right.
But I think there's ways to validate people and challenge that idea. Why do you feel that way? Oh, do you know someone who's been injured by a snake? Is that someone you know? Or is that something you've heard? Right? You know, I think there's ways to challenge people's ideas by getting them to think for themselves. And those are usually more effective than just telling them. I think that we as educators have been, you know, and as scientists have been taught to think about, for conservation reasons, population management and numbers. But for people, their emotional response thinking about killing and pinning an insect is the forefront of their mind. And if we don't acknowledge that, they might get the misdirected idea that we don't have feelings as scientists, or that these comic book villains of the, you know, conservationists that just went wild and snapped their fingers or something and half the world is gone, you know, get perpetuated, because those are things they're bombarded with that are maybe not very accurate.
Can I ask another question?
Yes. I think what I'm going to do is actually, since we're coming up on the 2-hour mark, I was going to stop the recording and have this be the kind of end of the official workshop, but then folks are welcome to continue asking questions for as long as Kaitlin and Barrett are available for that. So welcome more questions, but for now, I did want to thank both of our speakers so much for your incredible insights. This has been super, super useful. Thank you so much and inspiring. So I'm going to stop the recording